The gate was latched. Frances Callahan stood in the gray light of a Montana morning in the autumn of 1882, her hand pressed flat against the top rail of the cedar post gate, and she felt the cold metal of the latch beneath her palm like an accusation. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had been certain, absolutely, unshakably certain, that she had left it open last night. She remembered it clearly. She had been carrying 2 buckets of water in from the creek at dusk, both arms full, the weight pulling at her shoulders, and she had nudged the gate open with her hip and walked through and left it swinging. She had not gone back. She had been too tired. The kind of tired that sat in your bones like wet sand. But here it was, latched. The little iron pin slipped neatly through its catch, the way it only sat when someone had done it on purpose. This was not the first time. That was what made her chest feel hollow and her hands tremble slightly as she stood there in the frost-dusted grass with the sunrise burning pink behind the mountains. This was not even close to the first time. It had been happening for 6 weeks. Every single morning, without exception, without a single missed day, the gate she had either forgotten to latch or deliberately left open would be found perfectly secured by the time she walked out of her front door at first light. And in 6 weeks, despite getting up earlier and earlier, despite watching from her window until her eyes ached, despite setting a small strip of wool yarn across the gate post the way her father had taught her to catch intruders back in Missouri, despite all of it, she had never once seen who was doing it. She was beginning to feel like she was losing her mind. No, that was not quite the whole truth. There was something worse underneath the bewilderment. Something she did not want to name even in the privacy of her own skull. She was beginning to feel like she was being watched, like someone had made a silent, unilateral decision about her life, her land, her safety, and had not bothered to ask her permission. And in a territory where a woman alone on a homestead was considered either brave or foolish depending on who you asked, that feeling had a sharp, dangerous edge to it. She was still standing at the gate when the sound of hooves reached her from the main road, and she looked up sharply. A single rider moving at a slow walk, already past her property line, heading east toward town. She could see him clearly in the early light, tall in the saddle, wearing a dark coat and a low-brimmed hat, riding a steel-gray horse that moved with the kind of easy, unhurried grace that belonged to an animal that had been well treated for a long time. The rider did not look at her, did not slow down, did not give any sign at all that he knew she existed. But Frances Callahan had not survived 3 years on a homestead alone by being incurious. She memorized everything she could see before he disappeared around the bend in the road. The set of his shoulders, the color of the horse, the way he held the reins loose in his left hand. And then she went inside and made her coffee and sat down at her kitchen table and made a decision that she suspected was going to change things considerably. She was going to find out who he was. To understand what she was walking into, you have to go back to the spring of 1879, when Frances Callahan arrived in Harrow Creek, Montana Territory, with a trunk full of practical clothing, a deed to 160 acres of semi-arid grassland, and a grief so fresh and raw it showed in her face the way a brand shows on cattle. She was 26 years old. She had reddish-brown hair she kept pinned back with more determination than elegance, dark green eyes that missed very little, and hands that were already calloused from a childhood spent on her family's Missouri farm. She was not what most people would call a soft woman, but she was not hard either. She was the kind of woman who had learned early that the world did not particularly arrange itself around her comfort, and had simply decided to arrange herself around the world instead. She had come west because she had no reason left to stay east. Her mother had died the winter before of pneumonia. Her father had followed in the spring, so quickly after that the doctor said it was grief working faster than disease. She had no siblings. She had been engaged briefly to a man named Edmund Hale, who had turned out to be the sort of person who was perfectly agreeable so long as everything went his way. and who had very definite ideas about what Frances ought to do with her father's inheritance. When Frances told him she intended to file a homestead claim in Montana Territory under the provisions of the Homestead Act of 1862, he had called her decisions reckless and her nature willful, and she had handed him back his ring and not looked back. The land she had claimed was good land, or at least it had the bones of good land. There was a creek that ran reliable through the eastern edge of the property, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. There was grass that in a wet year could support 40 or 50 head of cattle. There was a one-room cabin that the previous claimant had abandoned, with a sound roof and a stone fireplace that drew well. Frances had spent her first summer reinforcing the walls, adding a second room, putting up a proper fence along the road frontage, and establishing a kitchen garden that produced more than she could eat. By her first winter she had 4 chickens, 2 hogs, and a mule named Patience who was, in Frances's private estimation, the most reliable soul in the territory. By the spring of her 3rd year, 1882, she had expanded the fence line, added a small barn, acquired a milk cow named Harriet, and built a reputation in Harrow Creek as a woman who paid her debts on time, kept excellent preserves, and was not to be trifled with. She had also accumulated a number of practical concerns that she had not fully anticipated when she filed her claim. The homestead was remote enough that she saw her nearest neighbors, the Oleander family, only once or twice a month. The road that ran past her front gate connected Harrow Creek to the larger town of Billings, which meant there was occasional traffic, but occasional could mean anything from 3 riders in a morning to no one for 4 days. The area had been generally peaceable, but there were rumors of claim jumpers working the eastern ranges, and 2 families she knew of had quietly abandoned their homesteads after unexplained incidents involving broken fences, missing livestock, and midnight visitors who left no names. And then there was the matter of the Colton brothers. Russ and Emmett Colton ran cattle on the 3 sections of land that bordered Frances's property on the north and west. They were not, technically speaking, criminals, but they operated in that practical gray space between legal and unlawful that was very common in territories where the law was thin on the ground and the land was thick with opportunity. They had made it known, through various intermediaries, that they considered Frances's homestead to be occupying ground that would be more productively used as part of their grazing range. And they had made this known in the particular way of men who believe that a woman alone will eventually simply get tired and leave. Frances had not gotten tired. She had gotten a better fence. But the fence had a gate, and the gate had become, in the autumn of 1882, the focal point of a mystery that was simultaneously aggravating, and, though she would not have admitted this to anyone, a little bit thrilling in a way she found deeply suspicious about herself. She went into Harrow Creek the very next morning. The town of Harrow Creek in 1882 was not a large place, but it was a living one. A main street of false-fronted buildings that included a general store, a livery stable, a barber shop that also served as the unofficial post office, a saloon called the Prairie Dog, and a 2-room building that housed both the telegraph office and the office of the county sheriff. A steady-tempered man named Caleb Prout, who had been holding this particular corner of Montana together with baling wire and personal authority for 7 years. There was also a small church, a schoolhouse, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Helena Cross, who made the best rhubarb pie in the territory and knew everything that happened within 30 miles of her establishment. Frances went to Mrs. Cross first. She found Helena in her kitchen, arms deep in bread dough, a woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair and sharp black eyes that had seen everything at least twice and forgotten very little of it. "I need to know," Frances said, sitting down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was the kind of thing Helena Cross permitted only from people she genuinely respected. "If there is a man in this county who rides a steel-gray horse and wears a dark coat, tall in the saddle. Comes past my road going east most mornings around first light. Helena's hands did not stop working the dough. That description fits about a dozen men I know of. He rides easy, Francis said, like a man who's been in the saddle since he was very young and hasn't thought about it consciously since. And the horse is exceptional, not a working horse. The kind of animal someone paid serious money for or raised from a foal with particular care. Helena's hands did slow then, just slightly. You're describing Jacob Boone. The name landed in the kitchen with a particular weight, the kind of weight that came not from volume, but from the fact that everyone in the room knew it meant something. Tell me about him, Francis said. Helena pulled her hands out of the dough and wiped them on her apron and sat down across from Francis, and the look on her face was one that Francis recognized as the look people wore when they were deciding how much truth to give you. Jacob Boone came to Harrow Creek about 4 months ago, Helena said. He doesn't say where from. He's got a piece of land he's improving about 2 miles south of yours, the old Whitfield place. He keeps to himself. Doesn't drink much, doesn't gamble, doesn't cause trouble. He does good work as a hired hand when people need it. Roy Delaney at the livery says he's the best man with horses he's ever seen. She paused. He's also, and I say this simply as a statement of observable fact, the best-looking man to come through this town in several years, which is why I know he's not married, because every unmarried woman between 16 and 40 has already made a thorough investigation of the matter. Francis ignored the last part with some effort. Does he have a dark past? Anyone know why he left where he came from? Helena looked at her steadily. No one knows. And in my experience, when a man who's clearly educated and clearly capable and clearly not lacking for resources comes to a remote place and won't say where he's been, there are 2 explanations. Either he's running from something, or he's trying to build something new without the weight of the old thing on top of it. Which do you think it is? I think, Helena said carefully, that it might be both. Francis rode home with that answer turning in her mind like a stone in a current, smoothing its edges as it went but not changing its essential shape. Jacob Boone. She said the name quietly to herself as Patience ambled along the road, and the name felt solid in her mouth, the way names did when they belonged to real people rather than abstractions. She was resolved on one thing. She was going to catch him at the gate. She devised a system that she was privately rather proud of. She had already tried watching from the window, but the gate was set back far enough from the cabin that in the pre-dawn darkness she could not see it clearly. So she moved a ladder-back chair to the window and draped a dark blanket around herself and set a cup of water beside her so she would have to stay awake to avoid knocking it over, and she began keeping watch from 2 in the morning onward. The first night she saw nothing. The gate was latched in the morning. The second night she fell asleep despite the water cup and woke with her cheek against the window frame and the gate latched and the sun already rising. She used some very unladylike language directed at herself. The third night she stayed awake through sheer, grinding will, and at approximately 4:30 in the morning she saw a shadow at the gate. A man's shape unmistakably. Tall, broad across the shoulders, moving with a quietness that was almost preternatural for someone of his size. He did not have a lantern. He did not need one. The moon was 3/4 full, and the sky was the particular clear black of high-altitude autumn nights. She watched him check the gate, adjust the latch with a single precise motion of his hand, and then step back and look at the cabin for a moment, just a moment, brief as a held breath, before he turned and walked away into the dark. He had not come on horseback, he had walked, which meant he had left his horse somewhere out of sight and come in on foot specifically so she would not hear him. That level of deliberate concealment should have alarmed her, and some small, rational part of her brain was indeed alarmed. But the larger, less rational part was noting something else, the way he had looked at the cabin. It had not been the look of someone surveilling a target. It had not had threat in it. It had been, and she was analyzing this very carefully in the dark, wrapped in her blanket, her heart beating fast. It had been the look of someone checking on something they cared about. The next morning, Frances Callahan did something that required more courage than fixing a fence or facing down the Colton brothers' hired men. She baked a pie. It was an apple pie, made from the dried apples she had put up in September, and she made the crust properly with good lard and cold water, and she crimped the edges the way her mother had shown her. Then she put it in a basket with a clean cloth over it, and she drove Patience to the old Whitfield place 2 miles south. The Whitfield property was being transformed. She could see that from the road. The old fence line had been repaired and extended. There was a new woodpile, enormous and neatly stacked, against the south side of the cabin. Someone had been working on the roof. There was a kitchen garden that had been turned and mulched for winter, and in the small paddock beside the barn stood a steel-gray horse of exceptional quality who raised his head and regarded her with large, intelligent eyes as she drove up. The man came out of the barn before she reached the front step. He had clearly heard her coming. He was wiping his hands on a cloth, and he stopped when he saw her, and they looked at each other across the distance of a few yards, and Frances felt something shift in the air between them like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. He was, she registered with a kind of helpless objectivity, exactly as Helena Cross had described. Tall, considerably taller than Frances, who was not short, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was set in the way of someone who was controlling a strong impulse toward some expression he was not ready to show. His eyes were a particular shade of light brown, almost amber in the morning light, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, though she recognized intelligence in it and something that might have been wariness. He was perhaps 30, maybe 32, the kind of age that sits between youth and gravity and makes a man interesting in ways that require attention to understand. "Mr. Boone," she said. She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. "Miss Callahan," he said. The fact that he knew her name without introduction told her several things simultaneously, all of them interesting. "I brought you a pie," she said. "Apple." He looked at the basket, then at her, and something moved across his face that was too quick and complicated to categorize. "That's generous," he said. "May I ask the occasion?" "I thought," Frances said, meeting his amber eyes steadily, "that someone who goes to considerable trouble on another person's behalf deserves at minimum a pie." The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long and contained, Frances estimated, about 4 years' worth of implications. The color along his jaw sharpened slightly. He was not a man who blushed easily, that much was clear, but he was a man who was, right now, recalculating something. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said, and it was the worst lie she had heard in recent memory, delivered without any conviction whatsoever. "Yes, you do," she said pleasantly. "You've been latching my gate every morning for 6 weeks. I watched you do it 3 nights ago, and I have a number of questions, the first of which is, why?" Another silence. He was looking at her with an expression that had shifted into something more open now, something that acknowledged the game was over and was deciding what came next. He looked down at his hands, then up at the mountains, then at her. He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was in that family. "Would you like to come in?" He said, "I'll make coffee." The inside of the Whitfield cabin was sparse but not neglected. He had a good table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, a stone fireplace that was identical in design to her own. There were books, more books than she would have expected, a short shelf of them that included what she could see were surveying manuals, a Shakespeare, and 2 or 3 titles she did not recognize. There was a rifle on pegs above the door. There was a coffee pot on the stove, and the smell of wood smoke and horses and pine, and something that was simply the smell of a man who lived alone and kept his house clean out of habit rather than expectation. He made the coffee. He set the pie on the table and found 2 plates. His movements in the small space were economic and practiced, the movements of someone who had learned to live efficiently in small quarters and had made peace with it. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. "Your gate faces southeast," he said finally. She blinked. She had not expected that to be the opening. "The Colton brothers run cattle on the land that borders your western fence line," he continued. He was looking at the table now, not at her, speaking in the deliberate tone of someone choosing words with care. "Russ Colton has been known to cut fence lines on properties he wants to acquire. It's slower than a direct approach and harder to prove. If your gate is left unlatched at night, cattle can push through it. By morning you might have 30 head of Colton cattle grazing your grass, and when Russ comes to collect them, he's also collecting the argument that your property line is unclear and your maintenance is negligent." Frances felt something cold move through her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You know this because you've seen him do it." "I know this," Jacob Boone said quietly, "because I've seen what he does to properties he wants. I worked the range east of Billings 2 seasons ago. A family named Sutter, husband, wife, 3 children, had the same thing happen. Gate left open, cattle pushed through, argument made about property boundaries, pressure applied. They sold for a fraction of what the land was worth. They didn't have the resources to fight it." He looked up at her then directly, and the amber eyes were very clear and very serious. "You do not seem like a woman who intends to sell." "I am not," Frances said, with a firmness that left no room for discussion. "Then I thought," he said, and the careful quality of his voice was doing something complicated to her chest, "that the least I could do was make sure the gate was latched." She looked at him for a long moment. There was so much she wanted to ask: why her property specifically, why 6 weeks, why the careful concealment, why he had come to Harrow Creek at all, what he was running from or building or both. But she had been raised by a practical woman who had always said that you ate the meal in front of you before you asked for the next course. "Thank you," she said. "That was a kind thing to do." Something in his face eased. Not completely. There was still something held back, something behind the amber eyes that was not quite ready to surface. But the tension in his jaw relaxed by a measurable degree. "It was a selfish thing to do," he said, with a candor that surprised them both, judging by the brief expression on his face. "If the Coltons acquire your land, my southern fence line is completely exposed." "That's a very practical reason," Frances said. "Yes," he agreed. He picked up his coffee cup. He did not look at her. "It is." She ate a piece of pie at his table and he ate a piece, and they talked about the coming winter and the condition of the road, and whether the spring would run through February or freeze. And by the time she drove Patience home, she knew 3 things with certainty. Jacob Boone was not telling her the whole truth. Jacob Boone was not, at the same time, lying to her, and the feeling that had shifted in the air between them when she first drove up to his property was not going away. It was, if anything, settling in. Like a thing that had found its proper place, she did not stop leaving her gate unlatched. She was not entirely sure why she did this, if she examined it honestly, though the practical explanation she gave herself was that she wanted to see whether he would continue. He did. Every morning. The gate was latched. She began to think of it as a kind of conversation, the only kind that did not require either of them to say more than they were ready to say. 2 weeks after she brought him the pie, he appeared at her front door on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hand, and a question that he delivered with the directness of someone who had rehearsed it, but was still not entirely comfortable with the rehearsal. "I'm going into Harrow Creek for supplies," he said. "I wondered if you needed anything brought back." "I was planning to go myself," she said. A pause. "We could go together," he said, "if you had no objection." She looked at him standing on her porch in the autumn light, his hat in his hands, his dark hair still damp as though he had washed his face not long ago, the amber eyes doing that careful, watchful thing that she was coming to understand was his natural register. He was not a man who showed everything. He was a man who had learned at some point and for some reason that showing everything was a luxury you could not always afford. "I have no objection," she said. "Give me 10 minutes." They drove into town in her wagon with his gray horse, whose name she learned was Courier, tethered at the back, and they talked in the way of people who are discovering that they can talk easily about everything except the things that matter most. He knew a great deal about range management and watershed conditions, and the likely future of the cattle industry in Montana Territory. She knew a great deal about homestead law and kitchen gardens, and the particular challenges of keeping a milk cow producing through a mountain winter. They were both, she realized, remarkably practical people who had ended up in this particular valley by routes that were not entirely practical, and there was something comfortable about that recognition even as it raised further questions. In Harrow Creek, they separated to do their respective errands and met at the general store, where Frances was engaged in a negotiation with Mr. Aldous Fry about the price of canning jars, and Jacob appeared at her elbow and watched the negotiation with an expression of quiet appreciation, and then, when Fry seemed to be digging in, said a single sentence in a calm, reasonable voice about how he had heard the new general store opening in Billings was offering quite competitive prices on dry goods, and Aldous Fry came to terms very quickly. "You didn't have to do that," Frances said as they walked out. "I know," Jacob said. He was almost smiling. Not quite, but the corner of his mouth had ideas about it. They stopped at Mrs. Cross's boarding house for a midday meal, and Helena Cross set food in front of them and said not one single word, which in Frances's estimation took considerable restraint, and which Frances mentally noted as something she would thank Helena for specifically at a later date. It was on the road home, with the mountains turning gold in the afternoon light and Courier walking easy beside the wagon, that the conversation shifted. "You said you'd worked the range east of Billings," Frances said. She was watching the road ahead, keeping her voice conversational. "Before that, a pause. Various places," he said. "That's a careful answer. It's an accurate one." She looked at him. He was looking at the road, his hands resting on his knees, his hat casting a shadow across his face. "Jacob," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him go very still beside her at the sound of it. "I'm not asking to expose a dark past. I'm asking because I'd like to understand who you are, and that generally requires knowing something about where a person has been." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I grew up in Missouri, St. Joseph. My father was a lawyer who was also a very high-handed man who had very specific plans for his son. I was supposed to study law and come into his practice and marry a woman he had chosen and continue a life that had been arranged without my consultation." He stopped. "I did most of those things. I studied law, I passed the bar, I married the woman." Frances said nothing. The road curved gently and the mountains slid along the horizon. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was a good person, not the right person for either of us, but a good person. She died in 1878 of childbed fever, along with the child, a son." The way he said it was the way people said things they had said many times before, so many times that the words had been worn smooth, but the thing underneath them had not been worn smooth at all. It was still raw at the center. Frances recognized that quality because she had it herself. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it with the full weight of a person who understood what grief at that scale felt like. "After that," he said, "I left. I had tried for a year to be the person my father needed me to be, and I could not do it. I sold what was mine to sell, settled what debts I could settle, and I went west. I have been west for 3 years, and I have been in Harrow Creek for 4 months, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like a place might become the place I actually live in rather than just a place I'm passing through." He stopped. He looked at her with the amber eyes doing something she had not seen them do before, something exposed and direct and a little bit afraid. "I'm telling you this," he said carefully, "because you asked, and because you are a person who seems to prefer honesty to convenience, and because—" He stopped again. He looked at his hands. "And because I think you have a right to know what kind of man is latching your gate every morning." Frances Callahan felt something happen in her chest that she was not prepared for and was not sure she had the vocabulary for. It was not simple attraction. She had been attracted to people before and knew that feeling. It was something larger and more alarming, the kind of feeling that announced itself with the same inevitability as weather. "The kind of man who latches my gate every morning," she said, keeping her voice steady with some effort, "is clearly a man of principle who prefers action to announcement. I do not find that a difficult kind of man to respect." He looked at her then, and what was in his face was something she had no name for yet but thought she might, given time, learn. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was not uncomfortable. When they reached her gate, which was, of course, latched, since she had latched it herself before leaving, he helped her unhitch Patience and carry her supplies inside, and she offered him coffee and he said yes. And they sat at her kitchen table as the last light went out of the sky and talked until it was dark enough that the stars were out. Fully out. The dense, extravagant stars of a Montana sky that never failed to make her feel that the world was very large and she was very small in it, but not somehow diminished by that. He left at 8 o'clock and walked out to where he had tethered Courier to the fence post and rode south, and Frances stood at her door and watched the gray horse carry him into the dark, and then she went inside and sat down in her kitchen chair and pressed both hands over her face and breathed. She was in very serious trouble. The trouble, as it turned out, did not wait long to declare itself in multiple directions at once. 3 days later, Russ Colton came to her front door. Russ Colton was a heavy-set man of 45, with a face like leather left in the sun and pale eyes that were never quite all the way warm. He came alone, which was unusual. He generally brought Emmett, his younger brother, or one of his hired men, which Frances had always interpreted as a statement about the kind of person he considered himself to be. Alone, he seemed slightly smaller, though not less purposeful. He stood on her porch with his hat on, which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of this call. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I'll get right to the point." "I appreciate that in anyone," she said. She did not open the door fully. "The winter's coming hard this year," he said. "I've got 60 head of cattle that need grazing room. Your eastern pasture is going to be sitting empty when the ground freezes. I'm prepared to offer you a fair lease arrangement, $20 for the season." $20 was not nothing. Frances was aware of that, but she was also aware that a lease arrangement with Russ Colton was the kind of thing that had an entrance and no exit. "I'm going to decline," she said, "but thank you for the offer." The pale eyes went through several calculations in quick succession. "Miss Callahan, I want to be direct with you. You are managing a considerable piece of land without substantial help. That's admirable, but the winters up here are not forgiving of a property that isn't fully resourced. Things happen, fences go down, livestock wander. A woman in your position might benefit considerably from having an established neighbor with resources on her side." This was said in the tone of a man who considered it a generous thing to say, which told Frances several things about Russ Colton's private understanding of his own threats. "I'm resourced," she said, "and my fences are maintained, but I'll keep your offer in mind." She closed the door before he finished whatever he had been about to say next. Her hands were shaking slightly as she went to the kitchen, and she disliked that about herself. She put the kettle on and stood looking out the window and thought carefully about the situation she was in, and then she saddled Patience and rode south. Jacob was splitting firewood when she arrived, and he stopped and looked at her with the immediate attention of someone who could read in a person's posture that something had happened. She told him about Colton's visit. She told him precisely and without embellishment, and he listened without interrupting, his face doing something grave and concentrated. "The offer of the lease is the next step," he said when she finished. "The step after that is finding some reason to argue that the lease gives him rights that extend beyond grazing. The step after that," he stopped. "You were right to decline." "I know that," she said with perhaps more sharpness than she intended. He looked at her, not stung, more like he had registered both the words and what was behind them. "Are you frightened?" The word landed in a tender place because it was the right word. "Yes," she said. She did not like admitting it, but she had promised herself she would not be the kind of person who let pride prevent honesty. Not of Colton directly, of the position. Of being alone in it. "You're not alone in it," he said, and the way he said it was so immediate and unequivocal that it caught her entirely off guard. She looked at him standing there with the axe in his hand and the wood chips on his coat and the amber eyes very direct and serious, and she felt that thing in her chest again, the thing that had announced itself on the wagon road home, except larger now. "Jacob," she said. "I know," he said. He put the axe down. He looked at his hands and then at her. "I know it's not a simple situation. You've built everything you have by yourself, and the last thing you need is someone presuming to stand between you and your own fight. I don't intend to do that." He looked up. "But I am your neighbor, and I have resources and information that are relevant to your situation, and I would be doing you a disservice by pretending otherwise." "What kind of resources?" she asked. "I told you I passed the bar in Missouri," he said. "Homestead law in Montana Territory is federal. I know it well. Colton's claims about your property boundaries being in dispute, I can address those directly with documentation. And I know," he paused, "the names of 3 families in the Eastern Range who had the same experience you are having. If they would testify to Sheriff Pruitt about Colton's methods, that changes the conversation considerably." Frances was quiet for a moment, processing this. "You've already been thinking about this," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "For how long?" He met her eyes. "Since before I started latching your gate." She let that sit for a moment. 6 weeks of getting up before dawn to walk 2 miles to a woman's property and secure a gate and walk 2 miles back, and the whole time he had been building a case in his head. The care in that, the deliberate, sustained care, was something she felt in her sternum. "I would like your help," she said. It cost her something to say it, but it was the right thing to say, and she said it without qualification. "Not because I cannot manage alone. Because 2 people with complementary resources are more effective than 1 person alone, and I have the sense that you understand this situation better than most people I could ask." "I do," he said, "and I would like to give it." They made a plan. It was practical and detailed and involved Jacob writing to 2 of the families he knew in the Eastern Range, and Frances obtaining copies of her original deed and survey documents from the county recorder's office in Billings, and both of them making a formal visit to Sheriff Pruitt with the combined documentation. It was not a plan that involved any dramatic confrontation or any dark heroism. It was the kind of plan that practical, intelligent people devise when they are determined to solve a problem lawfully and thoroughly. But it was also, Frances recognized clearly, the plan of 2 people who had decided to move through the world together, at least in this particular matter. And in her experience, when 2 people decide to move through the world together in one particular matter, the boundaries of that matter have a way of expanding. She rode home in the late afternoon with Patience's ears flicking at the October wind, and she felt something she had not felt in several years, the particular warmth of not being entirely alone in a thing. She had been fiercely, determinedly self-sufficient, and she was proud of it and did not intend to abandon it. But self-sufficiency, she thought, was not the same as solitude. She had been confusing the two, and the difference, now that she could see it, was significant. October moved forward and Jacob Boone moved into her days with the quiet, incremental inevitability of the season changing. He came to her property to help repair the northern fence line, which they did working side by side with a comfortable division of labor, Frances stringing wire, Jacob setting posts, both of them talking in the way they had discovered they could talk, directly, without performance, with the particular ease of people who have found that they are not going to have to explain themselves constantly to each other. He told her more about Missouri. She told him about her father's farm and her mother's kitchen and Edmund Hale's ring on the table. He laughed at the last part, a real laugh, fuller than the almost smiles, and she found she wanted to hear it again. She learned that he had read extensively on the subject of land rights and water rights in the Western Territories because, he said, he had seen what happened when people did not understand them. She learned that he had an extremely accurate eye for weather, which was genuinely useful in Montana. She learned that he played chess badly and that he knew it. She learned that he had a habit of going completely silent when he was thinking hard about something, which she initially interpreted as displeasure and then realized was simply his process. And once she understood it, she found it restful rather than alarming. He learned that she had a temper that she kept almost perfectly under control, except in situations involving deliberate dishonesty, at which point it surfaced quickly and specifically. He learned that she had an excellent memory for detail and a very poor memory for faces, which she compensated for by remembering everything about how a person moved and spoke. He learned that she made better biscuits than anyone he had encountered since leaving Missouri, a compliment she received with a pleasure she found slightly embarrassing given how much pride she had always taken in not caring what people thought of her cooking. The Colton situation moved through its slower, more procedural arc in parallel. The response letters from the Eastern Range families were delayed by weather and slow mail, but they came in November. One from a woman named Ruth Sutter who wrote with a controlled fury that spoke to everything Jacob had described, and one from a former ranch hand named Theodore McCready who had witnessed the fence gutting on 2 separate occasions. Frances and Jacob took both letters, along with her deed documentation and a careful summary of the events Jacob had written out in his neat, precise lawyer's hand, to Sheriff Prout on a cold November Tuesday. Caleb Prout read everything carefully twice and then leaned back in his chair and looked at them both across his desk. "This is a federal matter, some of it," he said. "The fence gutting is criminal mischief under territorial statute," Jacob said calmly. "The coercive pressure on property owners is potentially extortion if it can be proven to have been accompanied by threats. The letters constitute testimony of observed behavior," Frances added. Prout looked at them with an expression that held both appreciation and a kind of wry recognition. "You two are either going to be very useful to this county or very difficult," he said. "Why not both?" Frances said. He sent a letter to Russ Colton that same week. The letter was official, careful, and made it clear without specific accusation that certain activities in the area had come to the sheriff's attention, and that the county took property rights and the protections of the Homestead Act with appropriate seriousness. It was, as Jacob observed quietly when Frances told him about it, the kind of letter that accomplished what it needed to accomplish without providing anything that could be used in response. Prout was good at his job. Russ Colton did not come back to Frances's door. His cattle did push through her fence line once more in early December, but Frances was awake at first light when it happened, and she rode patients directly to Prout's office, and Prout rode out personally to document the breach. And after that the Colton brothers' cattle appeared to find other grazing arrangements. On the evening of the day the cattle incident was resolved, Frances stood at her kitchen stove making supper and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was not bracing for something. She was simply living on her land in her house, with her livestock settled in the barn and the fire burning well, and the snow falling soft outside her window. The feeling was so unfamiliar it took her several moments to identify it. She thought of Jacob, 2 miles south, and wondered if he was warm. She put a second bowl on the table, just in case. Then she laughed at herself for the presumption and put it away again. Then she stood there in her kitchen, 30 years old on a December evening in Montana territory, and decided that she was going to stop being afraid of the direction this was going. She invited him to Christmas dinner. It was not a grand event. It was 2 people at a table with a roasted chicken and preserved vegetables, and 2 pieces of pie and a lamp burning between them. And outside the snow was falling heavily, and the whole valley was white and silent. Jacob brought a bottle of apple brandy that he had acquired in Billings, and she found her mother's 2 good glasses, the only breakable things she had carried west, and they drank it in front of the fire after supper and talked about everything, and nothing in the particular way of an evening that neither person wants to end. At 10 o'clock he rose to go, and she walked him to the door, and he put his coat on and his hat and stood on her porch in the cold with the snow coming down around them both, and they looked at each other with all the words they had not said yet present in the air between them like the snow, visible and real. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said. And then he said nothing else for a moment, and she understood that he was carrying something he had not yet found the right way to say, and she had enough respect for his deliberateness to wait. "I want to be clear with you," he said. "I'm not a man with a simple past or simple circumstances, and I am aware that I have not always been, in my life, the person I intended to be. I was not a good husband in the ways that matter most because I was trying to be the person my father needed me to be rather than the person Clara needed, and that is a thing I will carry. But I am now, in this valley in this specific life, the person I actually am. And the person I actually am," he stopped, "is in considerable difficulty where you are concerned. The falling snow was very quiet. The lamp inside was very warm. Considerable difficulty," she said. "Yes," he said. The amber eyes were very steady on her face. "That is," she said, "the most honest and most circuitous love confession I have ever heard in my life." Something cracked open in his face, the almost smile becoming an actual one, full and surprising and transforming, and she thought, there it is. There is the person underneath all that careful management. "I'm out of practice," he said. "So am I," she said. She kissed him first. She made that decision deliberately and without apology, because she was Frances Callahan, and she had learned that if you wanted something you had better be willing to reach for it yourself. She put her hand on his jaw, which was cold from the night air and rough with 2 days of beard, and she kissed him in the snowfall on her porch, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a gentleness that were both very much present at once, and when they stepped apart she felt the cold for the first time because his warmth was gone. "Jacob," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her with the open, exposed thing fully present in his face, the guard completely down for once. "You should go home before the snow gets worse," she said, "and you should come back on Sunday." "Yes," he said, with a warmth in that single syllable that said everything. He rode home. She stood on the porch and watched Courier's gray shape disappear into the white dark, and then she went inside and sat by her fire for a long time with the 2 empty glasses on the table, and felt the evening settle around her like something permanent. The winter in Harrow Creek in 1882 to 1883 was hard in the way that Montana winters are hard, relentlessly, comprehensively, without apology. The snow came in December and did not go until April. The temperature dropped to levels that froze the creek in its upper reaches, and kept livestock in the barn for days at a stretch, and made every simple task a complicated one. Frances's hands cracked and bled from the cold and the constant work, and she treated them with the lard and beeswax salve her mother had taught her and kept working. Jacob came every Sunday and sometimes Wednesday as well. The road between their properties became, through repetition, something worn and known, a path that Courier traveled so regularly he did not need steering. On the Sundays he came early and they worked on whatever needed doing, repairing the barn roof, checking the livestock, reinforcing the south fence against snow drift. And then in the late afternoons they sat by the fire and talked or read or played chess, which Frances turned out to be considerably better at than Jacob, and which became the source of a running, gentle argument that was, they both privately acknowledged, entirely an excuse to argue about something that didn't matter in the least. He told her more about Clara, slowly, in pieces, across many evenings, not because she pressed him but because he seemed to need to put it somewhere outside himself. He told her about the early years of the marriage, which had been not unhappy but muted, 2 people living in a house that fit someone else's blueprint. He told her about the child, a son they had already decided to name Thomas, and the 3 days between the birth and Clara's death, which he described in spare, precise words that made the grief completely visible without any decoration. He told her how long it had taken him to understand that grief and guilt were not the same thing, and that he had been punishing himself for years with the guilt of not having loved Clara in the way he might have, if they had met differently, chosen differently. "You loved her," Francis said one evening, looking at the fire. "I did," he said, "not in the way she deserved, but yes." "Those are not mutually exclusive," she said. "People carry both all the time." He was quiet, and then he said, "You are very wise about things you haven't experienced." "I've watched enough people carry grief to know its shapes," she said. "My father's grief for my mother was different from my grief for my mother. They were looking at the same loss and seeing different things. Neither of them was wrong." He was looking at her with that expression she had come to know well, the one that said he was seeing her more clearly than most people had ever bothered to look. "What are you carrying?" he asked. She thought about it. "Loneliness," she said finally. "Not the simple kind. The kind where you're surrounded by things you chose and you know you chose rightly, and you are still somehow alone in a way that the choosing doesn't fix." "Yes," he said, "just that." And she understood from the single word that he knew exactly what she meant. They found their way to each other that winter slowly, and with the particular care of two people who had each already learned that some things, once broken, could not be easily repaired. But they were also two people who were not, by nature, inclined toward timidity, and there was a point in January when the slow, careful approach simply became the wrong speed. The way you know when a horse needs to move and holding it back becomes a violence rather than a kindness. He told her he loved her on a Tuesday evening in late January, not on a special occasion, not after any dramatic event, simply standing in her kitchen while she was putting supper on the table, saying it the way he said things that were true, directly, without embellishment, with the amber eyes doing the open, unguarded thing. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that. Not as a preliminary to something I'm asking, just as a thing that is true and that you have a right to know." She turned from the stove and looked at him standing in her kitchen, this deliberate, damaged, careful, unexpectedly tender man, and she felt the full weight of the past 6 months arrange itself into something that made complete sense in a way that very few things in her life ever had. "I love you," she said. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second time you came inside for coffee, which I found deeply inconvenient and have been managing ever since." He laughed. The full laugh, the one she always wanted to hear more of. "Managing," he said. "I'm a very capable manager," she said. "Of most things." "Not this," he said, with a gentleness that made it not a criticism. "No," she agreed. "Not this." He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the warm, lamplit room with the snow outside and the supper getting cold, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms and thought that she would like, very much, to feel that heartbeat for the rest of her life. February brought a blizzard that held Harrow Creek in its grip for 4 days and kept Jacob at her property, rather than trying to navigate 2 miles of whiteout. And those 4 days were, in their particular intimacy, something she thought about for a long time afterward, the two of them together in the small house, cooking and reading and talking and playing chess, and sitting by the fire in the evenings with the wind screaming outside and the lamp burning steady, learning the rhythms of each other in the ordinary, unglamorous, essential way that you only learn a person when you are sharing a closed space with them through a long emergency. He was, she discovered, a light sleeper who woke at the smallest sound, the habit, she understood, of someone who had spent years in places where sounds in the night meant something. He was also someone who, once fully awake and established that nothing was wrong, could fall back asleep with an ease she found both enviable and slightly maddening. He made coffee strong enough to be structural. He was meticulous about tools, returning every implement to exactly where he had found it. He was patient in the way of someone who had chosen patience deliberately rather than possessing it naturally, and it was a better kind of patience for that. She was, he discovered, someone who hummed when she was thinking without being aware she was doing it. Someone who kept 3 separate lists of things that needed doing, ranked by urgency, practicality, and personal preference, which were sometimes very different lists. Someone who was physically incapable of leaving a thing half-fixed. If she started mending something, she would finish it completely even if it took twice as long as she had meant to spend on it. Someone whose laugh, when it came fully, was generous and real and occasionally startling, and who clearly did not laugh that way with just anyone. On the last night of the blizzard, after the wind had dropped and the silence had come back, they sat by the fire and he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His face had the expression of someone who had been building toward something for a while and had finally arrived. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "But I want to be certain before I ask that you understand what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built here. I am not asking you to fold your life into mine. I'm asking," he paused, finding the words. "I am asking if you would be willing to let what you have built and what I am building become one thing, with both of us tending it. I am asking whether we could be partners in the full sense of that word, not husband as the law defines it, or not only that, but partners." Francis sat with his words for a moment, feeling their precise weight. "That is," she said, "still the most carefully constructed proposal I have ever heard." "It's the only one I intend to make," he said. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes to all of it," she said. "To being partners, to the building, to the one thing." She looked at him with the full directness she rarely turned on anything. "Yes, Jacob." He reached across the space between them and took her hand and held it with both of his. And they sat like that in front of the fire while the snow settled outside, and the fire burned down, and the lamp guttered low, and neither of them moved for a very long time. They married in March of 1883, when the snow was beginning to recede from the creek banks, and the first green was showing under last year's grass. The ceremony was held in the Harrow Creek Church, a small building that smelled of pine and candle wax, officiated by the circuit minister who came through every 6 weeks. It was not a large wedding. Helena Cross was there, dressed in her best dark wool and looking at Francis with an expression of deep private satisfaction. Sheriff Prout came and stood at the back. Roy Delaney from the livery came, and Aldous Fry from the general store, and the Oleander family, all 6 of them, came in their wagon from the neighboring property, the children scrubbed and polished, and the youngest one asleep throughout the entire ceremony. Frances wore her best dress, which was a deep green that suited her eyes and which she had made herself 2 winters before for an occasion that had not yet presented itself. She carried 3 sprigs of dried lavender because there was nothing else blooming in March in Montana Territory, and she did not particularly care because she was not marrying lavender. Jacob stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him as though it had been made for him, which she discovered afterward it had been. He had ridden to Billings in February and had it made by a tailor there, which was the kind of thing he had done quietly and mentioned only when she asked where the coat came from. He had not mentioned it beforehand because it would have sounded like bragging, which was not his nature, but he had wanted to be right for the occasion because she was worth being right for. She thought about that for a long time. He looked at her when she walked down the short aisle with the morning light coming through the church's single south-facing window, and the expression on his face was the open, unguarded one, completely unmanaged, full of everything he felt, and she thought, "I will remember this exact moment for as long as I live." The minister's words were brief and practical. The vows they had written themselves, simple and honest, speaking to the partnership they had agreed on rather than the legal transaction of a traditional ceremony. When the minister pronounced them married, and Jacob kissed her in front of the gathered community of Harrow Creek, Helena Cross made an uncharacteristic sound that was very close to a sniffle, which she immediately covered with a cough. The wedding dinner was at Helena's boarding house, which she had prepared with magnificent effort: roasted beef, and 3 kinds of vegetables, and 4 pies including, specifically, apple. And the community of Harrow Creek ate and drank together, and the Oleander children ran around the table legs, and Roy Delaney gave a toast that was genuinely moving and only slightly incoherent, and Sheriff Prout shook Jacob's hand with the air of a man who had reached certain conclusions about character over the course of the winter and was satisfied with them. In the morning they went home, both of them to the Callahan homestead, which would remain the Callahan homestead because Frances's name was on the deed and Jacob had, with his lawyer's understanding of the law, helped her ensure it stayed there regardless of the legal conventions of marriage that would otherwise have transferred her property to her husband's name automatically. They had worked through the documentation carefully and deliberately, and Frances had looked at him across the table while they reviewed the final papers and felt something that was not just love but specifically gratitude. The kind that came from being seen clearly by someone and having what they saw respected rather than managed. Jacob's piece of land, the old Whitfield property, they decided to keep separately titled but to work jointly. His fences and her fences became, in practical terms, one perimeter. Courier and Patience shared a paddock. Jacob's considerable library took up one wall of the second room. Her canning jars took up another. They were partners. It worked. The first spring of their marriage was the best spring Frances could remember in her time in Montana. The snowmelt was heavy, and the creek ran full, and her kitchen garden was the most productive it had ever been. They planted an orchard, 6 apple trees, and 2 pear on the south slope between the two properties, which would not bear fruit for years, but which they planted with the easy confidence of people who intended to be there when it did. In April, Emmett Colton came to town and made a scene in the Prairie Dog Saloon about the letter his brother had received from the sheriff, and the scene resulted in Emmett spending a night in Prout's jail and having a conversation with Jacob the following morning that was, by all accounts from people who were present, extremely quiet, extremely civil, and extremely definitive. Whatever was said in that conversation, the Colton brothers' interest in the neighboring homesteads appeared to conclude. Ruth Sutter, whose letter had been part of the documentation, wrote back in May to say that she and her family had returned to their Eastern Range property and were rebuilding, and that the situation had improved considerably since the sheriff's office in that county had received the file that Jacob had compiled and forwarded. Frances read that letter aloud to Jacob at the breakfast table, and he listened with the expression of someone who found quiet satisfaction in a thing done correctly and did not require more acknowledgement than that. "You did a good thing," she said. "We did," he said. "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "You did. I had the gate." He smiled at that, the full smile, and she thought about how rarely he had smiled when she first knew him, and how often he smiled now and what the difference meant. She was pregnant by June. She knew it before she told him, sitting with the knowledge for 2 weeks, which was partly caution. She had known women who announced too early and then had cause to grieve, and partly a private savoring, the way you hold a good thing for a moment before sharing it because the sharing changes it into something different, which is also good but also permanently different. She told him on a Sunday evening in July with the windows open and the summer air moving through the house, sitting across the table from him after supper. "Jacob," she said, "I'm going to have a baby." He was completely still for a moment. Something moved across his face that was complicated and very deep joy and fear and grief and love all present at once, all of them real, none of them canceling the others. She had expected this. She had thought carefully about how he would receive this news, given Thomas, given Clara, given everything, and she had prepared herself to hold all of it with him. "When?" he asked. His voice was steady, with the effort it took to make it so. "February, I think," she said. "Perhaps March." He nodded. He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his the way he had the night of the blizzard and held them. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "So am I," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. His hands tightened slightly on hers. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am healthy and I am strong, and Mrs. Cross has already recommended the doctor in Billings who is, apparently, excellent. I intend to approach this with thorough preparation and a considerable amount of stubbornness." He made a sound that was both a laugh and something else. "That sounds exactly right," he said. He was magnificent through the pregnancy, which Frances noted and appreciated while simultaneously insisting, on most days, that she did not need managing. He understood the distinction. She could tell he understood it because he never attempted to take over anything she was capable of doing herself, but he was consistently, specifically attentive to the things that had genuinely become more difficult, which is a completely different thing, and which required far more intelligence than simple protectiveness. He also, without announcement, began walking the fence line every morning in addition to his other work, which she recognized as the same impulse that had started the gate latching, the need to do something active in response to a situation that required patience, the need to stand between something he loved and the things that might harm it. She loved him very much for it. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was gentler than the previous one. The snow came later and the temperature held. Frances continued working through November and December with modifications rather than cessation, and the Billings doctor came out in January to assess her and declared her remarkably fit and the baby well-positioned. Helena Cross came to stay in February, sleeping in the second room and taking over the heavier household work without being asked, and without making Frances feel managed, which was a social skill of considerable refinement. Their son was born on the 14th of February, 1884, in the early morning hours, with the snow falling outside and Jacob's hand in hers through the long night. He was large and loud and emphatic about his arrival, and when the doctor put him in Frances's arms, she felt something shift in her chest permanently, a tectonic thing, the kind of change that does not reverse. She looked at Jacob, who was sitting beside the bed with his eyes very bright, and she saw him see the child, their child, and understood exactly what was happening in his face, the grief and the love occupying the same moment, the new thing and the lost thing present together. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her sharply. "If you would like," she said carefully. "I thought if you would like to give him that name, for the son you lost, I thought he might carry it forward." Jacob was quiet for long enough that she thought she had read it wrong and began to frame an apology, but then he said, very quietly, "His name is Thomas Jacob Boone," and she felt the weight and rightness of it settle over all three of them like a quilt. Thomas Jacob Boone was, from the very beginning, a person of considerable opinion and physical energy and loud communication, all of which Frances received as evidence of excellent character. He had Jacob's amber eyes and Frances's stubborn mouth, and an absolute imperviousness to weather that suited his circumstances perfectly. Jacob was with his son with the full, unheld tenderness of someone who had been given a second chance at something he had lost before he could fully hold it. He was not, Frances observed, a man who performed parenthood for others' observation. He was simply present, getting up at night without being asked, talking to Thomas with the same directness and seriousness he brought to adult conversations, which in her experience was the correct approach to people of any age. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm that was full and difficult and good in the specific way that things earned are good. The orchard trees grew. The kitchen garden expanded. They added 6 cattle of their own in the spring of 1884, chosen with Jacob's careful eye and managed with Frances's thorough practicality. And by autumn they had a small, legitimate, profitable operation that was theirs in every sense of the word. Sheriff Prout asked Jacob, in the fall of 1884, whether he would consider standing as a county commissioner, a position that was elected by the local population, and that required exactly the combination of legal knowledge, practical understanding of property and range issues, and personal credibility that Jacob possessed in full measure. Jacob discussed it with Frances for an entire evening, laying out every consideration, and she listened and then said, "It's a good fit. Do it. We'll manage the additional demands." He was elected in November by a comfortable margin, partly because he was competent and partly because Frances, who knew virtually every family in the county, by this point through her commerce at the general store, and her trading at the church and her direct, memorable way of engaging with people, was a formidable political asset without having tried to be one. Being county commissioner gave Jacob a formal platform for the land rights and property documentation work he had already been doing informally, and he used it thoroughly. He worked with the county recorder to establish clearer surveying and documentation standards. He worked with Sheriff Prout to develop a formal reporting mechanism for the kind of coercive pressure the Colton brothers had applied, which created a record that discouraged future attempts. Several families who had been considering abandoning their claims decided to stay. Frances, for her part, became a central figure in the practical life of Harrow Creek in ways that accumulated naturally from her abilities and her character. She began keeping a small lending library, her books and Jacob's combined, that people came to borrow from on a mostly honor system. She helped Helena Cross establish a medical supply fund that allowed the community to pool resources for medicine in years when the cost would have been prohibitive for individual families. She was not interested in being a public figure and declined 3 separate invitations to join organizing committees, but she was consistently present and consistently useful, which in a small community amounts to something more lasting than any title. In the spring of 1886, she had their second child, a girl this time, born in April when the first green was coming back to the valley and the creek was running fast and clean with snowmelt. She was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter about her arrival, with Frances's dark green eyes and Jacob's dark hair, and they named her Clara Ann, the Ann for Frances's mother, and the Clara for Jacob's first wife in the way that Frances had decided made sense, not erasure, not replacement, but acknowledgement, continuation, the living weave of history that everyone carried. Jacob held Clara Ann on her first day and looked at Frances over the baby's head with an expression that she would keep for the rest of her life like a pressed flower, the full, open, unmanaged face of a man completely without defenses against his own happiness. "Thank you," he said. "We did this together," she said. "As is our custom," he smiled. "As is our custom." Thomas, who was 2 years old and had been waiting for this event with an impatience entirely characteristic of him, came to meet his sister with the solemn dignity of someone accepting a large responsibility, and he touched her face with one careful finger and announced that she was very small and that he would watch out for her. And Frances and Jacob exchanged a look above his head that contained the entire complicated treasure of parenthood. The gate, in those years, was reliably latched. Jacob had long since taken over the formal maintenance of the front fence line, not because Frances could not do it, but because he found it, she understood, to be the right kind of work. The quiet, early morning work of keeping the boundary of their life together sound and secure. Sometimes she woke early and lay in bed and listened for the sound of the gate, the soft click of the latch in the morning quiet, and she thought about how it had started 6 weeks of anonymous care before she ever spoke to him, all that purposeful, concealed tenderness, and felt the rightness of it reverberate through everything that had come after. She never told him she could hear it, because some things were allowed to remain both a secret and a gift simultaneously. In 1887, the apple trees in the orchard bore their first real fruit, small apples, tentative, but real and sweet and entirely theirs. Frances picked them on a warm September morning with Thomas helping, his small serious face intent on finding the best ones, while Jacob held Clara on his hip and watched them with an expression of such complete and unself-conscious contentment that Frances had to stop and just look at him for a moment. This man she had gone looking for with nothing but a description and a pie. This man whose name she had not known until Helena Cross said it. This man who had gotten up before dawn every day for 6 weeks to walk 2 miles and latch her gate and walk home again without asking for anything in return. "Jacob," she said. He looked at her across the orchard rows. "Yes." "I am very glad," she said, "that I brought you that pie." He laughed the full, generous laugh, and Clara laughed too in response, not knowing why but joining in with the uncomplicated delight of a 2-year-old. And Thomas looked up from his apple inspection with an expression of profound tolerance for adult inexplicability. "So am I," Jacob said, "though I suspect you would have found your way to me eventually, with or without it." "I found my way to you," she said. "The pie was merely practical." "As is your custom," he said, warm and exact. "As is my custom," she agreed. The orchard grew, the children grew. The homestead, which Frances had built from a deed and a mule and a one-room cabin into a working, living, beautiful piece of land, continued to grow in the way that things grow when they are tended by people who love them and each other in equal and reinforcing measure. Harrow Creek grew too. The railroad came through in 1888, 12 miles north of town, and the access to markets transformed the economics of the entire valley. Jacob, as county commissioner, had spent 2 years in careful negotiation with the railroad company about the terms of land access and the conditions of the work camps, ensuring that the agreements were documented and enforceable in ways that protected the existing property owners and treated the workers with appropriate fairness. It was not a glamorous piece of work, but it was thorough, and it was right, and the community felt its effects for years. Frances established, in 1889, a small school endowment with proceeds from 2 particularly good years of garden production and cattle sales, not enough to fund a teacher on its own, but combined with contributions from 6 other families and a matching amount from the county fund that Jacob helped allocate. It was enough to keep the schoolhouse open through the summer months, which it previously had not been. Thomas started school in 1889, the year Montana became a state. He was 5, almost 6, and he was ready in the way of children who have been talked to seriously since before they could talk back. Clara Ann would follow 2 years later, with the focused intensity that seemed to be her particular character, and which neither parent was surprised by. The autumn of 1890, on a morning very like the morning that had started everything frost on the grass, the mountains going gold, the sky that particular deep blue of high-altitude October, Frances came out of her front door at first light and stood on her porch with her coffee and looked at her gate. It was, of course, latched. She had not forgotten to latch it. She never forgot any more. But Jacob had gone out before her, as he always did, and had checked it, as he always did, and the small, precise click of the latch in the morning cold was as much a part of the day as the smell of coffee or the sound of the creek. She heard his boots on the porch steps before she saw him, coming around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn with 2 eggs in his hand from the morning collection, and his breath coming visible in the cold air. He stopped when he saw her standing there looking at the gate. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. She turned and looked at him, the dark hair fully threaded with gray at the temples now, the amber eyes exactly as they had always been, the set of his shoulders still carrying that particular quality of a man who had come to peace with where he was. "I was just thinking about gates." He came up the steps and stood beside her and looked at the gate, and then at her with the expression she knew completely. "It's latched," he said. "Yes," she said. "It always is." He looked at her for another moment, and in that moment she saw him understand what she was saying, the full span of it from the beginning, the 6 weeks, the pie, the winter, the church, the children, the orchard, the whole accumulated architecture of their life together. And what came into his face was something she could not have named in any single word, but that sat exactly where love sits when it has had time to become something larger than itself. "Come inside," she said. "Your coffee is getting cold." "Yes," he said. He held the door for her. She went through. He followed. The gate stood perfectly latched behind them in the October morning, the mountains above Harrow Creek burning with autumn color, the valley settling into the golden pause between summer and winter, everything in its proper place, everything tended, everything held. Inside, the stove was warm. The children were beginning to stir in the back room. Thomas's voice came first, low and purposeful, asking some question that Clara's higher voice answered with authority. The smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the ordinary particular smell of a house that had been lived in fully and well, filled the small rooms. Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Frances and sat across the table from her, and they looked at each other in the morning light with everything between them that had accumulated across 8 years. Grief worked through and set down, fear faced and survived, land defended and cultivated, children loved and growing, losses honored and carried forward into living things, all of it present and all of it good. "I have something I want to tell you," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "I have wanted to tell you since approximately the first morning you came to my door with that apple pie," he said, with the careful precision he brought to things that mattered very much, "that whatever life I was before is entirely irrelevant compared to whatever life I am now, and that you are the specific reason for that distinction." She held her coffee cup in both hands. "Jacob, I know you know," he said, "but I wanted to say it properly." "You have," she said, "many times, in many ways." "Including the gate," he said with the shadow of a smile. "Including the gate," she agreed, "perhaps especially the gate." The children came in from the back room then, Thomas leading with his particular focused energy and Clara behind him with her morning composure. And the day opened up around them, all the ordinary, irreplaceable, specific day of a life, built exactly as it should be built, by 2 people who had looked honestly at who they were and what they needed and had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of what choosing meant, to do it together. Frances Callahan, Frances Boone, in the world's understanding, though she remained Callahan on the deed and in her own naming as they had agreed, both names part of the same true thing, poured cream into her coffee and looked at her family at her table in her house on her land, all of it earned, all of it kept, all of it alive, and felt something that required no words at all. The gate was latched. It would be latched tomorrow. And the day after, and the day after that, all through the long good years ahead, as the orchard grew and the children grew, and the valley settled into what it was becoming, a place where 2 people had decided to plant themselves, and had flourished beyond the reach of fear or loneliness or any force that had ever tried to move them. She had never caught him doing it in those first 6 weeks. But she had caught something far more important in everything that followed. The wholeness of a man who loved with his hands as well as his words, who showed himself in small faithful acts before he could trust himself to say the larger thing, who had walked 2 miles in the dark every morning because he could not yet tell her that he wanted to protect her, and so he had simply done it, and kept doing it, and would keep doing it for as long as he drew breath. Some mornings she still paused at the gate for a moment, hand on the latch, before going about her day. Some mornings she still felt the cold metal under her palm and felt the whole shape of the story in it, how it had begun, what it had become, what it would continue to be. The latch was iron, the gate was cedar, the hand that had set it was her husband's, and all of it was hers. She went back inside. Jacob looked up from helping Thomas with his bootlaces. Clara was already at the table with the expression of someone who has important opinions about breakfast. "What were you doing?" Jacob asked. "Checking the gate," Frances said. "It's latched," he said. "I know," she said. She sat down. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, the way you touched things that were both ordinary and sacred. "I know." The morning came fully up over the mountains, the light burning clean and gold across the valley, and in the house on the Callahan homestead the day began as all good days begin, with warmth and coffee and the sound of people who love each other going about the work of living. The gate held. The land held. Everything that had been built with labor and courage and patience and deliberate, faithful love held completely, and the holding was everything.